Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're going to talk about something that happens in warm up rings and clinic arenas and training barns all over the world. Something so ordinary, so woven into the fabric of equestrian life that most riders don't even register it as a psychological event. They just live inside it. Here's the scene. You've been working on the same exercise for months. Some days it clicks, most days it doesn't quite, and then you watch a professional rider pick up the same exercise and do it in about 30 seconds, effortlessly, like the horse simply volunteered, like breathing. And in the few seconds that follow, something shifts in your head. It doesn't feel dramatic, it rarely announces itself, but something has quietly recalibrated in the way you see yourself in relation to this sport. The gap has been measured, and the measurement hasn't been filed as information, it's been filed as a verdict. That shift is what today's episode is about, because what the research suggests is that this moment, this very ordinary, very familiar moment, can set in motion a sequence of psychological and even physiological events that shapes not just how you feel about your writing, but what you attempt, how much effort you extend, and over time, whether you continue to develop at all. Let's start with the most basic piece: social comparison, the tendency to evaluate yourself in relation to other people. This is not a character flaw. Research suggests it tends to be fairly automatic, a deeply ingrained cognitive habit rather than a deliberate choice, though people can learn to notice it and work with it rather than simply being carried along by it. Leon Festinger, whose foundational work on social comparison theory is well over half a century old now, established that humans are essentially oriented toward assessing themselves in relation to others, particularly in domains where there is no clean, objective measure of how you're doing. And equestrian sport, if you think about it, is almost perfectly designed for this. Yes, there are scores and placings, but the subjective experience of whether you are good enough, whether your progress is adequate, whether you belong in this arena at this level with these people, has no clean metric. That ambiguity creates fertile ground for comparison to fill the interpretive gap. Now, there are different kinds of social comparison. The one most relevant to us today is what researchers call upward social comparison. Simple definition: measuring yourself against someone who performs at a higher level than you do. That might sound useful, and under some conditions, it genuinely can be. But meta analytic research, which means research that pools findings from dozens of individual studies to look for consistent patterns, suggests that upward social comparison tends to lower self evaluations and generate negative emotional responses, particularly in ability focused domains. The mechanism researchers point to is something called the contrast effect. Proximity to a higher standard can make your own standard feel lower, not because your actual performance has changed, because the frame around it has. And here is what makes this particularly worth paying attention to in the equestrian world. The person you are comparing yourself to, the professional rider, represents a structurally different category of participation. They ride multiple horses every single day, often for decades. They have coaching infrastructure, financial support, and institutional resources that most amateurs will never access. Comparing your single weekly lesson to that baseline is not a meaningful evaluation of your ability. It is, if you want to be precise about it, a category error dressed up as a performance assessment. The comparison tends to land emotionally before there is any opportunity to examine it rationally. The gap gets registered, and the self concept shifts accordingly, though how much and in which direction varies considerably between individuals and contexts. There is an important nuance here worth holding on to. Not all upward comparison produces the same effect. Research shows a nonlinear pattern: modest gaps, where the higher performer seems at least potentially attainable, where the distance between you and them feels developmental rather than fundamental, tend to increase effort and aspiration. The person you watch and think, "I could get there one day," can motivate you. The problem tends to arise with the large gap, where the distance feels not like a difference in training time or resources or accumulated practice, but like a difference in fundamental type. That is the threshold where upward comparison may stop being instructive and start producing something researchers call learned helplessness. Learned helplessness. It's a term originally developed through research on organisms repeatedly exposed to outcomes they had no control over, who eventually stopped trying to change their situation even when the ability to do so became available. The mechanism is cognitive. The brain builds a model of the relationship between effort and outcome, and when that model consistently returns something close to no connection, the tendency is to stop investing effort. In the equestrian context, learned helplessness doesn't usually arrive all at once. It accumulates through repeated exposure to comparisons that seem to confirm a ceiling, through scores that never seem to reach the level you admire, through watching professionals at your barn for months or years and quietly, gradually building a mental model that suggests the gap between you and them is structural rather than developmental. In practice, this sounds like riders like me don't do Grand Prix, or some people can sit the trot and some just can't, or I'm not naturally talented at this. Each of those statements functions as a ceiling, and research on expectancy effects suggests that the ceilings people set for themselves can shape behavior in self reinforcing ways. Lower expected outcomes tend to generate lower effort investments, which can produce lower outcomes, which may then confirm the original expectation. Researchers call this the behavioral confirmation loop. A belief about ability begins to influence performance outcomes, not necessarily because the belief was accurate, but because it was acted upon. Now, I want to talk about something that might explain experiences many of you have had at clinics or competitions and never quite understood. Because it goes beyond psychology and into the body. Research on evaluative, hierarchical settings suggests that the experience of being observed by or compared to someone perceived as significantly more skilled tends to activate the sympathetic nervous system. The fight or flight response begins. And the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs a calmer, more regulated state, tends to be suppressed. Research on what's called autonomic balance, the interplay between these two branches of the nervous system, suggests that higher parasympathetic tone tends to support better cognitive performance, more flexible decision making, and more precise motor control under pressure. Equestrian riding requires precisely that kind of state: quiet, fine motor precision, subtle and sensitive communication through the reins and seat and leg. Riding in a warm up ring next to a professional you feel acutely compared against doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it may be generating a physiological state that makes riding well genuinely harder. And here is a layer that I find particularly interesting. When a rider arrives at the horse in a state of heightened sympathetic activation, the horse may receive some of that information. Research on human animal interaction suggests that horses are sensitive to human physiological and emotional states, and that the relationship between horse and rider tends to be bidirectional in this regard. A tense rider can make a horse tenser. A tenser horse becomes harder to ride. The performance deteriorates, and the rider watches the professional ride the same horse later, looking soft and effective, and concludes the gap is skill. Regulation may well be part of that difference, though it is worth noting that the picture is usually more complex than any single explanation captures. Let me bring in one more piece of the puzzle because I think it's the one that explains the most specific and frustrating experiences. There is a phenomenon in performance psychology called choking under pressure. Most people know the phrase, fewer people understand the mechanism, and understanding it changes the way you interpret those clinic rides and warm up ring moments that go inexplicably wrong. Here is what tends to happen. Most skilled motor performance, the kind that feels smooth and integrated and almost automatic in a familiar training environment, operates primarily through what researchers call implicit processing. Implicit processing is procedural, largely unconscious and highly efficient. It's what experienced riders mean when they describe riding by feel. The horse and rider operating together without the rider consciously directing each weight shift, each contact adjustment, each half halt. Implicit processing is fast, accurate, and deeply embedded through years of practice. But it appears to be vulnerable to one specific kind of interference: conscious monitoring. When evaluative pressure increases, when you become suddenly acutely aware that someone is watching and judging, the brain may shift from this fluid implicit mode toward explicit, consciously directed processing. You start thinking about your leg position, you think about your shoulder alignment, you think about your elbow angle. Each of those thoughts is well intentioned, none of them help. In fact, research suggests that directing conscious attention toward procedural movements normally governed by implicit systems tends to disrupt those systems, producing the fragmented, over controlled, thinking too much performance that every rider recognizes from their worst clinic experiences. Research using brain imaging technology has observed this kind of shift, with changes in brain activity associated with cognitive control accompanying deteriorations in motor fluency that would otherwise be automatic. The rider in that moment is not less skilled. Her skills are temporarily less accessible, disrupted by the very attentional processes that evaluative pressure has activated. That distinction matters. The problem is not your capability. It is the attentional context in which that capability is being asked to express itself. When you understand that, the fragmented clinic ride stops being evidence of your ceiling. It becomes something more like a data point about the attentional environment. So, what can you actually do with all of this? The research converges on one central practical reframe: the shift from what researchers call evaluative reference to informational reference. An evaluative reference answers the question, how do I compare? An informational reference answers a completely different question, what can I learn? Those two questions, watching the same professional execute the same movement, tend to produce quite different psychological and physiological responses. Research on observational learning in sport suggests that when learners deliberately adopt a learning focus orientation, actively extracting specific, applicable skill information from watching higher performers, the effect on self efficacy tends to be positive. The professional becomes a demonstration of what is possible and what specific components might be worth attending to, not a measuring stick against which your current performance is weighed and found wanting. Research on what's called the role model effect adds useful nuance here. When a higher performer is perceived as representing an achievable future state, when there seems to be a developmental path between where you are and where they are, the motivational effect tends to be more positive. When that same performer seems to represent a categorically different kind of ability, the effect tends toward discouragement. Attainability, crucially, is largely a matter of framing rather than objective fact. There is a reasonable argument that the professional and the amateur share more fundamental skill architecture and more developmental pathway than the current gap in performance might suggest. The distance between where you are and where they are is mostly time, resources, and accumulated repetition. That is a developmental gap. It may not be a categorical one. Research on growth mindset in performance contexts, the belief that ability develops through effort and practice rather than being fixed at birth, suggests that when learners are explicitly helped to understand ability as something that grows, self efficacy tends to increase, persistence under difficulty improves, and engagement with challenging material deepens. In most equestrian barn cultures, that framing is simply never offered. The hierarchy speaks for itself. And as we've seen today, what it tends to communicate by default is fixed rather than developmental. Hierarchies exist in every high skill domain. The professional shadow is real, and it falls across every training barn and every warm up ring where amateurs and elites share the same space. The research doesn't suggest it disappears. What it suggests is that once you understand the specific mechanisms, the contrast effect that may distort self assessment, the physiological state that tends to degrade motor precision, the attentional shift that can temporarily disrupt access to the very skills you've built, these things stop operating invisibly. They become legible, and what is legible can, at least in part, be worked with. The professional shadow may stop functioning as a ceiling when you understand what it actually is, not evidence of a fundamental limit, but a set of predictable responses to a specific information environment. And information environments, unlike ceilings, can be worked with. If today's episode opened something up for you, if the idea that your worst clinic rides might have more to do with attentional context than with actual skill lands somewhere useful, I want to point you toward a book that goes into all of this in considerably more depth. It's called The Amateur's Edge, and it's available now on Amazon. It's a full, research grounded examination of the psychology behind equestrian performance for riders who aren't professionals, but who are deeply, genuinely serious about the craft. It covers the content we explored today and much more: the neuroscience of pressure, the specific mechanics of how confidence erodes and how it can be rebuilt, the physiological realities of riding under stress, and the evidence based practices that address each one. Not tips, not motivation, an honest, accurate account of what may actually be happening in the rider's mind and nervous system and what the research suggests can be done about it. Search The Amateur's Edge on Amazon. Thank you for spending this time here. The fact that you're willing to look this carefully at what is happening inside your own head, not just your position in the saddle, matters. That is where the real work lives. Until next time, keep riding, keep thinking, and I'll see you on the other side.